would you do if your whole life changed in one morning and the town decided your punishment for being proud was marriage to a man you barely knew? The dusty streets of Prosperity Creek carried that question in every whisper the day Charlotte May Whitmore's world fell apart. It was autumn of 1847, and the cold Colorado wind had not yet learned how cruel people could be. Charlotte stood at her bedroom window as the sun rose, thinking it was another ordinary day. She had no idea it was the last morning she would wake up as the banker's daughter, admired, respected, and untouched by hardship. Charlotte was 22, beautiful, sharp-minded, and stubborn. Her golden hair glowed like sunlight itself, and her green eyes always held a quiet spark. People in Prosperity Creek said she was blessed with everything a young woman could want, but they also said she was too proud, too strong, too unwilling to bow to the rules expected of her. That pride became her downfall the day she refused Marcus Harrison, the judge's only son. Marcus had assumed she would say yes to him simply because he was powerful. When she rejected him, the humiliation burned through town like wildfire. Charlotte didn't know it yet, but that single no would cost her everything. Her father's voice thundered from downstairs. "Charlotte May, come down here at once." She walked down the long oak staircase, her dress brushing against the polished wood. When she entered the parlor, her heart dropped. Judge Harrison sat there, stiff and cold, his gray eyes sharp as knives. Her father paced the room like a trapped animal. "Sit," the judge ordered. Charlotte stayed standing, lifting her chin. "I prefer to stand." Her father snapped, "You will do as you are told. Your pride has cost us dearly." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his voice low and cruel. "Miss Whitmore, your rejection of my son has brought shame on my family, and your father owes me $50,000. The debt is due tomorrow." Charlotte's breath caught. She knew nothing of this debt. She looked at her father, seeing fear in his tired eyes. "I am willing to forgive the entire debt," the judge said, "on one condition." Charlotte felt the room close in. "What condition?" "You will marry someone of my choosing, someone who will teach you humility." Her father could not meet her eyes. "Charlotte, if we refuse, we lose everything." Judge Harrison's smile chilled her. "Thomas Beckett, he works in my stables. He cannot read or write. He has been a servant his whole life. You will marry him." The words hit her like a blow. A servant, an illiterate servant. Her life, her dreams, her status. Everything slipped through her fingers in an instant. "You want me to marry a stable hand?" she whispered. "It is that," the judge said, "or your father goes to debtor's prison. Choose." Charlotte closed her eyes. She had no choice at all. "I accept." The town exploded with gossip. The banker's daughter, forced to marry a simple servant. People followed her with their eyes, whispering at every corner. Charlotte locked herself in her room for a week before the wedding, eating almost nothing. Anger, humiliation, and dread wrapped around her like chains. On the day of the wedding, Charlotte wore her mother's old dress, hurriedly adjusted to fit her. Thomas Beckett wore a borrowed jacket too tight around his broad shoulders. He was tall, strong from years of labor, with dark, tousled hair and deep brown eyes that held a quiet sadness. Charlotte refused to look at him. The preacher rushed through the vows like he wanted to escape the room. "I do," Charlotte said softly, her voice trembling. "I do," Thomas said, his voice steady and warm, though he never reached for her hand. When it was over, Thomas helped her into a small wagon and drove her to the cabin he had built himself. The cabin stood alone on open land, simple but clean, with a stone fireplace and windows facing the mountains. Inside, the silence grew heavy. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her wedding dress. She felt like she had been buried alive. Thomas stood by the window. He cleared his throat gently. "I know this ain't the life you wanted," he said, "and I know you think you're too good for me." Charlotte looked up sharply, ready to argue, ready to deny it. But she couldn't, not honestly. Thomas kept talking, still looking at the sky. "I may not read words, but I can read people. I see the pain you're carrying. I understand it." He turned to her, and she saw something she had missed before. Kindness, strength, a quiet intelligence not taught in books. "I won't force anything on you," he said. "You don't owe me a thing. You can sleep in the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Charlotte stared at him in shock. She had expected anger, maybe even cruelty. She had prepared herself for the worst. Instead, this man she believed was beneath her was the only person showing her actual respect. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. Thomas sat in a wooden chair, keeping his distance. "Judge Harrison promised me land if I married you. I've worked for others my whole life. Owning even a small piece of land, it meant something." He paused, his voice softer. "But when I saw how broken you looked, I almost said no." "Why didn't you?" Quote, "Because I figured maybe I could make this easier for you. Maybe I could be a good husband in the ways that matter." Charlotte felt something shift inside her, not love, not yet, but confusion, curiosity, and for the first time the smallest spark of hope. Days passed. And every day, she began to see things she never expected. Thomas was not simple. He was not slow. He was not lesser. He was smart in ways no one had given him credit for. And Charlotte's heart, though she fought it, began to change. Charlotte woke the next morning, expecting the sharp sting of regret, but instead she found the cabin warm, with the smell of firewood and fresh bread. Thomas moved quietly around the small kitchen, careful not to disturb her. He didn't look like the men she grew up around. He was steady, humble, and gentle with everything he touched, even with her. That first week, Charlotte spoke only when necessary. She held her chin high, trying to protect the last piece of pride she had left. But Thomas never pushed, never complained, never demanded that she act like a wife. Instead, he gave her space. He spent his days tending the horses, repairing tools, hunting for food, building small improvements around the cabin. In the evenings, he would sit near the fire, not too close, and tell stories from the old cowboys he had worked with. Charlotte never admitted it, but she listened to every word. One night, after a long stretch of silence, Thomas paused mid-story and glanced at her. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, "but you can, if you ever want to." Something in his tone broke through her walls. "I miss my mother," she whispered before she could stop herself. Thomas nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. A few nights later, Charlotte watched him repair a broken harness. His stitches were neat and exact. He worked with a focus she rarely saw in educated men. "You could be more than a stable hand," she said without thinking. Thomas gave a small smile. "Not in this world." "You could be," Charlotte said again, "if you could read." Thomas froze. "Reading?" His voice held a mix of fear and hope. "You mean you'd teach me?" Quote. She hesitated, but the answer was already inside her. "If you want to learn." His eyes softened. "More than anything." From that night on, their evenings changed. The fire crackled while Charlotte wrote simple words on a slate board. "Cat," she said. "Cat," Thomas repeated, slowly tracing the letters. He struggled at first, but he didn't give up. He worked with the same patience he gave to the horses, the garden, and every chore he touched. Within a week, he read simple sentences. Within a month, he wrote small notes to Charlotte. They were shaky but hopeful, each one signed with his careful handwriting. And every day, Charlotte felt her heart pulling toward him in ways she didn't understand. One evening, as snow began to fall, Thomas read her a short poem from one of her books. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the words with a kind of wonder. "It's like the world opens up," he said quietly. "Like everything makes more sense." Charlotte turned away so he wouldn't see her eyes warm. This rough, humble man was growing before her eyes, becoming someone remarkable, someone she respected, someone she liked. Winter deepened. Their cabin became a small world of light and warmth. Thomas continued to learn, faster than she expected. And Charlotte, who once believed she had been handed the cruelest fate, now looked forward to every quiet night beside him. One evening, after Thomas finished reading, he set the book down. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Charlotte nodded. "Do you still regret it, being married to me?" She looked at him, really looked at him, at his steady hands, his warm eyes, his gentle strength. Her voice trembled. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted, "but I know it isn't regret." Thomas's breath caught, and Charlotte saw hope flash in his eyes like sunrise. As weeks passed, Charlotte realized something had shifted. The cabin didn't feel small anymore. It felt safe. And Thomas didn't feel like a stranger. He felt like someone who had been waiting for her without even knowing it. One morning in early spring, she found a folded note on the kitchen table in Thomas's handwriting. "My dear wife, I know our marriage began in pain, but being with you has changed my life. You gave me reading and you gave me hope. I don't expect your heart, but I pray that someday you might choose me, your husband. Thomas." Charlotte read the note twice, tears welling in her eyes. No man had ever spoken to her that honestly. No man had ever seen her the way Thomas did. When he walked through the door a few minutes later, she stood waiting for him. "Thomas," she whispered, "I need to tell you something." He stopped, concern in his eyes. "What is it?" Quote, "I think," her voice shook, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Thomas stepped back as if the words stunned him. "Charlotte," he breathed, "are you sure?" Quote, she nodded, tears running down her cheeks. "I'm sure." What followed that night was not awkward or forced or frightening like she had once feared. It was gentle, warm, and full of trust. For the first time, Charlotte felt like she had chosen her own life, rather than having it decided for her. Spring arrived with color and warmth. Charlotte laughed more. Thomas read every evening. The cabin filled with stories and new dreams. The town whispered again, but this time in surprise. The punishment marriage had become something beautiful. Everything seemed perfect. Until the day a lone horseman arrived with a message that would test everything Charlotte and Thomas had built. The warm spring sun lay across the fields like a golden blanket the morning the horseman arrived. Charlotte was hanging freshly washed linens on the line, while Thomas repaired a fence post near the garden. Life had settled into something peaceful and steady. Something that felt like home. But the moment the rider galloped toward their cabin, Charlotte felt the air tighten. The man pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around him. He held a folded envelope in his hand, marked with the seal of the Harrison family. Thomas's jaw tensed. "What brings you out here?" The rider looked uneasy. "Message for Mrs. Charlotte Beckett." Charlotte wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. Her name looked strange on the envelope. Strange, but right. She broke the seal with careful fingers. The message was short. "Charlotte, you and your husband must come to town immediately. This concerns your family. Judge Harrison." Her stomach dropped. "Thomas, something's wrong." They hitched the wagon and rode into Prosperity Creek in tense silence. Charlotte clutched the letter like a lifeline. The closer they got to town, the more the whispers followed. People stared at them in a way Charlotte had not seen since her forced wedding, but this time the looks were not cruel. They were worried. Judge Harrison waited outside the courthouse, not with arrogance, but with something Charlotte had never seen in him before: remorse. "Charlotte, Thomas, thank you for coming." Thomas stepped closer, protective. "What is this about?" The judge cleared his throat. He seemed older somehow, weighed down. "Charlotte, your father, he has taken ill, very ill." Charlotte's breath caught. "My father? What happened?" "He collapsed at the bank yesterday," the judge said softly. "The doctor believes it's his heart." Charlotte's chest tightened. She had not spoken to her father since her wedding day. The hurt between them was still heavy, still unhealed, but the thought of losing him, losing family, sent a cold fear through her. "Take us to him," Thomas said gently. They followed the judge to the Whitmore home. Charlotte hadn't seen it since she left. The walls were still polished, the curtains still expensive, but the house felt empty without the pride she once carried there. Her father lay on a bed, pale, weak, struggling to breathe. He looked nothing like the powerful man she grew up with. "Charlotte," he whispered when he saw her. She rushed to his side. "Papa, I'm here." Tears filled his tired eyes. "I did wrong by you. I let my fear and pride push you into a corner you didn't deserve." Charlotte held his hand tightly. "We both made mistakes." "I thought I was protecting our family," he said with effort, "but I should have protected you." Charlotte's heart ached. She had carried anger for so long, but seeing him like this melted the last of it away. "You're my daughter," he whispered, "and you deserved better than the choice I gave you." Charlotte shook her head. "Papa, the life I have now, it's not a punishment." Her father's gaze shifted to Thomas, who stood quietly near the door. "You care for my girl?" her father asked. Thomas stepped forward and spoke with steady truth. "With everything in me, sir." A weak smile spread across her father's face. "Then she's safer than she ever was with me." He squeezed Charlotte's hand once more, then closed his eyes, falling into a deep, exhausted sleep. Outside the room, Judge Harrison waited. For once, he did not look powerful. He looked like a man facing his own ghosts. "I owe you both more than I can ever repay," he said quietly. "I used my authority to punish instead of guide. I forced a choice that wasn't mine to make." Charlotte straightened. "Judge, we built something good from what you forced on us, but what you did, it was cruel." "I know," he said, pain in his voice. "That's why I came to say something I never thought I would say. I'm sorry." Quote. Thomas studied the judge for a long moment before nodding once. Apology accepted. But the past is done. We're moving forward. For the first time, the judge gave them a humble smile. "I see that now." That summer, Charlotte's father slowly recovered. Not fully, but enough to sit on the porch and watch the sun set. Charlotte visited often, bringing soup and stories of her new life. Thomas always stayed outside, giving father and daughter space, until her father asked him to join them. One evening, her father reached over and placed his frail hand on Thomas's. "Thank you for loving her," he said softly. "I prayed she'd find happiness. God answered in a way I never expected." After that, Charlotte felt the final weight lift from her heart. Months passed, and the cabin became a place full of laughter, books, learning, and love. Thomas began teaching other workers to read. Charlotte opened a small school for children who lived too far from town. People who once whispered about their marriage now came seeking their guidance. On their first anniversary, Thomas surprised her with a handmade leather journal. Inside the first page, he had written in his now steady handwriting, "For my beloved wife, who saw past what the world thought, and loved the man I truly am." Charlotte pressed her hand to her mouth, tears filling her eyes. She wrote beneath his words, "For my husband, who taught me that love grows fastest when planted in the soil of humility and kindness." That night, as snow softly covered the valley, Charlotte rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. "Do you think people will remember our story?" she asked. Thomas kissed her forehead. "Our story ain't over, and the best parts haven't even been written yet." Outside, the wind swept across the land, but inside their warm little cabin, they held each other close. Their marriage had begun as punishment, but through patience, forgiveness, and the courage to see each other truly, it had become a love that changed everything. What started as a cruel fate became the greatest blessing of both their lives. The proud daughter and the illiterate servant had found something deeper than status or wealth.